Static crackled over the bridge of the Kalin dreadnought, and Commander Xyler smiled because to his species, that sound was the music of conquest. For centuries the Kalin had ruled their stretch of the Orion Spur with a ritual so simple it had become doctrine. They appeared. They transmitted a single command. Submit or burn. Lesser civilizations always answered the same way in the end, with panic first, then pleading, then silence. So when Subcommander VRE announced an artificial mass drifting through the claimed emptiness of Sector 4, Xyler expected nothing more than another surrender waiting to happen. The holoscape painted the object in cold blue light. Slow. Primitive. Titanium, steel, carbon composites. No energy shielding. A hybrid fusion chemical drive so weak it was almost insulting. Xyler ordered the Void Piercer into visual range. When the feeds sharpened, the vessel that appeared looked less like a warship than a warehouse thrown into space. It was bulky, modular, ugly, with radiator fins jutting from the hull like exposed ribs. Markings ran across its side in a language he did not know. A merchant vessel. A freight hauler. The kind of ship that should have begged the moment it saw what was hunting it. Inside that same freighter, Captain Rico Stanton was engaged in a bitter fight with a broken coffee dispenser. The machine rattled, groaned, and spat a lukewarm brown sludge into his mug. Rico stared at it with the quiet betrayal of a man who had crossed too much vacuum to be treated this badly by his own galley. Sarah Jenkins called from the comm station that Mark Interstellar had paid for a fusion core, not luxury. Arthur Pendleton added from the pilot's seat that powdered garbage built character. Rico was still deciding whether to insult the coffee, the company, or both when Arthur's voice changed. A massive gravitational displacement had appeared on long-range scanners. Then it stopped being long-range. It was right on top of them. Rico drifted to the bridge and saw the stars vanish behind a black wedge of metal. The alien ship was enormous, bristling with weapons larger than the Ulysses itself. Sarah's hands moved fast over her console. No transponder. No registry. No match in any civilian or UN military database. Its forward batteries were running hot. Targeting locks were forming. Silence settled over the bridge, but Rico did not panic. He had spent 20 years running deep space routes through storms, debris fields, and enough bad luck to stop respecting surprise. He slid into the captain's chair and kept his voice level. Hold course. No sudden evasive maneuvers. They were not outrunning anything that size with a full cargo hold of raw palladium. Prep the translation matrix. Let's see what they want. On the Void Piercer, Xyler waited for the usual chaos and got nothing. The freighter did not turn. Its engines did not flare. No shields rose. No weapons powered up. It simply continued drifting on its original line with a slowness that felt almost offensive. VRE confirmed 3 biological life signs aboard and still no sign of defense. Xyler leaned forward, more irritated than amused now. He ordered Standard Subjugation Protocol Alpha. The Dreadnought's comm array fired a tight beam burst built not merely to communicate but to overwhelm. The data packet was dense enough to crash weak systems, blind primitive sensors, and leave lesser species helpless before the ultimatum even finished translating. Aboard the Ulysses, the alarm chirped once. Sarah frowned at her display, then almost laughed. Whoever had sent the transmission was forcing nearly 5 petabytes per second through their receiver, apparently expecting to fry the ship's systems on contact. Instead, the modified quantum routing architecture chewed through the packet in milliseconds and handed it cleanly to the linguistics AI. When Sarah put it on speakers, the bridge filled with a sound like metal scraping across glass before the machine flattened it into cold English. Unknown vessel. You have trespassed into sovereign Kalin territory. Your technology is obsolete. Your defenses are non-existent. Power down. Prepare to be boarded. Resistance will result in immediate atomic vaporization. Arthur let out a low whistle. Rico rubbed his chin, looked at the warship on the screen, and asked Sarah for protocol on first contact with a hostile non-human intelligence. She already knew the answer. Directive 44. Commercial crews were forbidden from improvising diplomacy for the species. All telemetry, sensor data, and communications were to be handed over immediately to Earth control through the deep space network. Rico gave a tired nod. Right, he said, "We do not get paid enough to represent the entire human race. Link the quantum-entangled comms. Route their signal to Houston. Let the bureaucrats deal with it." Sarah flipped the physical relay switch, and deep in the belly of the Ulysses a chamber of supercooled cesium atoms woke like a buried nerve. The quantum-entangled comms system synchronized instantly with its twin thousands of light-years away, bridging the abyss between a blocky freight hauler and the administrative heart of Earth. On the human bridge, nothing about the motion felt dramatic. Sarah routed the hostile signal with the same focus she might have used to file a maintenance report. Rico watched the alien dreadnought on the screen and waited. He had expected threats. He had not expected the strangest part of the encounter to be how routine his own crew treated it. On the bridge of the Void Piercer, Subcommander Vari's scales darkened in alarm. The primitive ship had generated a sudden power spike, but it was not weapons fire. It was not shields. It was a sharp, impossible fracture in space itself. Xyler demanded an explanation. VRE's claws moved across the console, then slowed. The readings made no tactical sense. The freighter was not answering the Kalin at all. It was patching them through. Then the Kalin systems began to scream. The whole escape flickered so violently that officers recoiled from their stations. Ordered tactical streams dissolved beneath an incoming flood of metadata. It was not a counterattack. Their systems were simply trying to parse the background noise attached to the connection the humans had opened. Shipping lanes. Billions of entangled devices. Military defense grids. Orbital structures. Artificial rings. Authentication handshakes arriving in such impossible volume that the translation software stalled and VRE's console spat sparks. The signal, he whispered, was no longer attached to a single vessel. It was a planetary network. In Houston, Texas, it was 2:14 in the morning, and Thomas Vance had been halfway through a stale donut when his monitor turned a violent red. Directive 44. First contact vessel. Ulysses. For one suspended second he thought it had to be a drill. Then the live quantum signatures resolved and the truth landed all at once. A standard commercial hauler in Sector 4 had just hardlined an extraterrestrial threat straight to his desk. Thomas hit the red alert button beneath his terminal, waking the Secretary General, NASA Command, and the Earth Defense Fleet in one cascade. But protocol was clear. The operator on duty had to establish the handshake and hold the line until the civilians were safe. Thomas adjusted his headset and remembered the phrase drilled into him during training. Be polite. Be professional. Be bureaucratic. Aliens are not. Then he keyed the mic. Unidentified vessel. This is Houston Control, United Nations Space Command. We are receiving your transmission via the marked commercial vessel Ulysses. Please be advised you are illuminating a registered civilian craft with targeting sensors in violation of interstellar navigational treaties. Stand down your weapon systems and state your registry and intentions. The translation rolled across the Kalin bridge in flat, perfect tones. Silence followed. Xyler stared at the audio visualizer as if the words themselves were an insult. This voice did not belong to prey. It did not tremble. It did not posture. It sounded like an irritated clerk correcting a paperwork error. What is a Houston Control? Xyler roared. Trace the source. Very tried. The signal bounced through so many relays the origin seemed to smear across the stars. Orbital platforms. Defense grids. Artificial habitats. The civilization attached to the line controlled thousands of systems. Worse, the telemetry still bleeding through implied that this Houston Control was casually monitoring over 80,000 commercial flights while speaking to them. Xyler felt something cold settle in his primary stomach. But the Kalin had ruled too long through fear to surrender it now. He leaned toward the comm station and forced iron back into his voice. He identified himself as Commander Xyler of the Kalin Empire, a dreadnought of the Supreme Fleet. He declared the Ulysses in violation of Kalin territory. He demanded surrender of the human vessel. Then he promised that if Earth did not comply, he would reduce the freighter to atoms and trace the signal back to its home world and burn it from the stars. Thomas listened to the translation through a military assist AI and sighed. On his secondary monitor, the response was already unfolding. Fleets around Mars and Jupiter had received the Directive 44 alert. Admiral William Hackett had authorized the slipspace drives of the 7th Vanguard Fleet. Thomas keyed the mic again, and every trace of warmth left his voice. Commander Zeiler, be advised that the Ulysses is a protected asset under the jurisdiction of Earth Control. Your threat has been logged and classified as Class 1 hostile intent. For your situational awareness, Houston Control has authorized the deployment of the 7th Vanguard Fleet. Disengage your targeting locks in the next 30 seconds, or you will be designated an active combatant and neutralized. On the Kalin bridge, Barry's console gave a shrill new alarm. Then he looked up in horror. Commander, he choked, sensors are detecting spatial tears. The first spatial tear opened without sound, but every Kalin on the bridge of the Void Piercer felt it in their bones. One moment the stars beyond the viewport were fixed and cold. The next, space itself warped like dark water struck by a falling god. Radiant blue light bled through the vacuum in jagged wounds. Veri's voice cracked as the numbers updated faster than he could read them. 72 destroyers. Then 75 signatures. 3 carrier groups. Every one of them pouring into real space with outputs so violent the Kalin sensors struggled to process them. Commander Zeiler stepped toward the viewport and forgot how to breathe. Out of the ruptures came human warships, nothing like the ugly cargo brick drifting ahead of them. These vessels were sleek, monolithic predators plated in silver-black metamaterials that drank starlight. Long magnetic accelerator spines glowed along their hulls in synchronized blue. They did not scatter chaotically as lesser navies would. They arrived in total silence and perfect formation, sliding into an inescapable sphere around the dreadnought so precise it felt premeditated. For the first time in his career, Zeiler understood what true strategic superiority felt like from the wrong side of it. He had thought he was ambushing a weak, lost lamb. Instead he had tugged on a leash attached to a sleeping Titan, and now that Titan had opened its eyes. Thomas Vance's voice returned over the channel, still flat, still maddeningly calm. Commander Zeiler, you have 10 seconds to power down your weapons. Houston Control is waiting for your compliance. No rage. No theatrical promise of vengeance. Just a countdown delivered with the indifference of a clerk reading departure times. That, more than the fleet outside, made the bridge feel suddenly small. 9 seconds. The tactical hull escape turned white, flooded not by malfunction but by the energy bloom of 75 ruptures still bleeding radiation into Sector 4. Veri's hands shook over the console. Every human ship had a targeting lock. Their weapon signatures were dense matter projectiles accelerated to impossible velocities. If even a fraction of that ring fired, the Void Piercer would not die in battle. It would simply cease to have significance. 8 seconds. Zeiler forced his mandibles apart. Engage sublight drives. Emergency jump. Get us out of this system. The dreadnought's dark matter engines roared to life, sending a deep vibration through every deck plate. Power climbed. The hull groaned. For one desperate instant, Zeiler clung to the illusion that Kalin authority was returning. 5 seconds. A low synthetic hum rolled across the ship, not loud, not violent, just absolute. It sank through armor, bone, and pride alike. Then the engine vibration vanished. Every display snapped back into focus, and what it showed was impossible. Maximum output. No thrust. No vector change. No jump corridor. We are not moving, he whispered. Commander, the spatial fabric around us has been locked. For seconds. A new human voice entered the channel, older and heavier than Houston Control. You are caught in a localized metric tensor field generated by the UNC Trafalgar. You aren't going anywhere, Kalin vessel. Power down your weapons, or we will carve your ship into scrap metal. Zeiler looked through the port side viewport and saw the Trafalgar. It was a warship so immense it made the Void Piercer feel juvenile. Its main rail cannon was aimed straight at the bridge, the barrel so wide it looked less like a weapon than a tunnel cut into reality. 3 seconds. The bridge had gone beyond panic now. Panic was noisy. This was worse. Officers stared at their stations with the frozen stillness of prey that has finally seen the trap close. The ugly merchant freighter still drifted in the center of it all, untouched and almost peaceful, framed by leviathans that had crossed light years because someone had threatened a civilian shipping route. Zyler's pride broke. "Power them down," he roared. "Disengage plasma batteries. Vent the firing chambers. Do it now." The order ripped through the bridge. Orange heat signatures sputtered and died across the external feed. Weapons platforms vented harmlessly into space in long plumes of wasted fury. One by one, the locks on the Ulysses vanished. Then the void piercer went dark. It no longer looked like the terror of the Orion Spur. It looked like a dead slab of obsidian floating helplessly in a steel snare, pinned beneath the cold attention of a civilization that had answered a freight captain's distress call with the fleet. On the Ulysses, Rico Stanton finally let out a breath. Arthur pulled his trembling hands away from the controls. Sarah stared at the tactical display and grinned. The alien dreadnought was dead in the water, fully immobilized in a gravity well. Then a secure ping arrived from the flagship commanding the trap. Admiral William Hackett had taken over the scene. 30 minutes later, the starboard airlock of the void piercer hissed open, and the silence in the docking bay turned brittle. Subcommander Very stood with 10 Kalin shock troopers in full assault armor, each one a towering reptilian predator built by conquest and law to be the final word in any battle. Their rifles should have looked steady. Instead their grip trembled. Through the pressurized umbilical came 6 human marines in matte black power armor, moving with such smooth mechanical grace that the heavy suits seemed weightless. They fanned out, secured the bay, and never once bothered to aim their weapons. Then Admiral William Hackett walked in. He wore no armor. Just a dark blue uniform, a modest row of ribbons, and the tired expression of a man pulled away from more important work. He carried a slim black data pad under one arm. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked like an auditor. Without glancing at the Kalin troopers, he fixed his eyes on VRE and spoke in perfect Kalin through the translator at his collar. "Take me to your commander." VRE obeyed before he understood why. On the bridge, Commander Zyler drew himself to full height behind the dais. He flared his scales, broadened his chest, and tried to cast a shadow over the human. He named his empire. He named his fleet. He warned that the Kalin ruled 300 star systems and that any harm done here would begin a war humanity could not survive. Hackett stopped in the center of the bridge and looked profoundly bored. Then he tapped the data pad. A holographic star map unfolded between them. First came the tiny Kalin cluster in the Perseus arm. Then the image widened, and the bridge went still. Blue lines flooded the darkness. Human slipspace lanes. Colonies. Orbital rings. Industrial webs spanning so much of the Orion Spur that Kalin territory looked less like an empire than a stain. Hackett began listing facts in a dry voice. Kalin Prime. 400 years of faster-than-light travel. Rudimentary dark matter fusion. A habit of subjugating weaker species through orbital bombardment. Humanity had been mapping Kalin radio traffic for the better part of a century. "You are not a secret," Hackett said. "You are a known statistical anomaly." Zyler felt the insult hit harder than fear. "A statistical anomaly?" "A level 2 hazard zone," Hackett replied. Then he checked the pad and added, specifically, a protected wildlife preserve with hostile tendencies. No one on the bridge moved. For centuries the Kalin had believed themselves apex predators. To humanity they were not feared rivals. They were dangerous local fauna occupying inconvenient space. Zyler forced his mandibles apart. "Then why are you here?" Hackett's eyes hardened. "Because you left your sandbox." The Ulysses belonged to a human commercial entity backed by Earth's central economy. Zyler had threatened civilian crew, disrupted a trade route, and forced a fleet mobilization that burned millions in fuel just to remind him of his place. Then Hackett displayed the treaty. Ceasefire and containment. The Kalin would retract to a 50 light-year radius around Kalin Prime. They would cease attacking primitive species. Their dreadnoughts would be dismantled, beginning with the void piercer. In exchange, humanity would not turn Kalin Prime into a glass parking lot. Xyler stared at the glowing document. "We are warriors. We will not sign our own neutering." Hackett shrugged. "Then I return to my flagship. The Trafalgar puts a kinetic slug through your reactor, and the 7th Vanguard Fleet jumps to your home world to dismantle your governing infrastructure." Then he leaned forward slightly and his voice dropped. "We stopped conquering each other centuries ago because it was bad for business. Do not mistake that for weakness. We are very, very good at war." Xyler looked at the Marines by the door. Then he looked out the viewport. The Ulysses was already firing its thrusters, calmly preparing to resume its route as if the Kalin dreadnought beside it had already become debris. That hurt more than the threat. His surrender should have been epic, stamped into history with fire and ruin. Instead it had become paperwork. His talons shook as he reached toward the hologram. "Where do I apply my biometric signature?" When his thumb touched the sensor on Hackett's pad, the device answered with a bright, cheerful ding. The sound was unbearable. "Biometrics confirmed," Hackett said, sliding the pad back under his arm. "Treaty filed with the Geneva Central Database. Thank you for your cooperation, Commander." Xyler stared at him. "That is it." "That is it," Hackett replied. "My job was to secure the trade route and protect civilian assets." Then he turned toward the airlock. "And your dreadnought is remaining here." For one brief, agonizing minute after Admiral Hackett left, the bridge of the Voidpiercer stayed silent. Commander Xyler stared through the viewport at the empty dark, almost unable to believe the human fleet was truly gone. They were alive. Then the proximity alarms began to scream. Veery lunged to his sensor console, scales bleaching pale. More slipspace ruptures were opening around them. Panic ripped through the bridge. They lied various. "The humans are returning to finish us." But the ships coming out of the anomalies were not the sleek silver-black predators that had pinned them in place. These vessels were blocky industrial leviathans made of exposed scaffolding, glowing reactors, and enormous crane arms painted in hazard yellow and visibility orange. Names crawled across their hulls in translated fragments that sounded less like war and more like billing departments. They were not warships. They were demolition yards with engines. An unencrypted broadcast hit the bridge. A woman's voice came over the speakers, tired, brisk, and utterly unimpressed. She identified herself as Catherine Price, Senior Adjuster for Lloyd's of London Interstellar. Per the terms of the Hackett-Xyler Treaty, she informed them, the Voidpiercer had been legally classified as hostile contraband and surrendered as collateral to cover the deployment costs of the 7th Vanguard Fleet. The Kalin crew was now trespassing on UN corporate salvage. They had 30 Earth Standard minutes to gather personal belongings and evacuate. If they left a mess, cleaning fees would be billed to Kalin Prime. Xyler slammed both fists onto his console. "This is the Voidpiercer," he roared. "Flagship of the Northern Expanse. Its hull is forged from collapsed dwarf star alloy." Catherine Price did not miss a beat. "Yes, Commander," she said flatly, "and it will make excellent rebar for the new orbital bypass ring around Jupiter." Outside the viewports, the humiliation began at once. Magnetic clamps the size of city blocks slammed into the dreadnought's armor. Human workers in mechanized EVA suits poured from the salvage ships carrying thermal lances. They did not even wait for the Kalin to leave. Molten lines were already spreading across the aft propulsion block as the humans cut the legendary warship into manageable commercial chunks. The deepest shame was not destruction in battle. It was repossession by a corporate auditor. Then Veery pointed toward a small vessel easing toward the forward airlock. It looked absurdly fragile, just a metal tube with engines bolted to the back. Faded blue lettering ran along the side. "Greyhound Interstellar Transit." "Commander," Veery whispered, "I believe that is our ride." The trip home was worse than captivity because it was so ordinary. 100 of the fiercest warriors in the Orion Spur sat crammed together on synthetic leather seats that smelled of recycled air and disinfectant. Their pilot was a human teenager chewing synthetic gum who never once acknowledged their murderous stares. He spent the 3-day journey playing loud Earth music through the intercom and ignoring them. When the transport finally dropped from slipspace, Kalin Prime filled the viewport, volcanic, ash-wreathed, ringed by an orbital defense grid that had always seemed impregnable. For the first time since Sector 4, Xyler felt something like hope. That hope died in the Citadel. The High Council chamber was carved from black obsidian and lit by geothermal fire. At its center sat High Counselor Varric, ancient, scarred, and terrible. Xyler knelt knowing he was already dead in the eyes of Kalin Law. Varric's voice rolled across the chamber like grinding stone. You return without the Voidpiercer. You return on a pathetic, unarmed alien shuttle. Speak before I have your hide stripped from you. Keeping his head bowed, Xyler delivered the truth. Humanity was not a fledgling race. It was a civilization spanning the Orion Spur. Its military strength was incomprehensible. He had surrendered to save his crew and prevent the humans from tracing their jump coordinates back to Kalin Prime. The chamber erupted. Counselors roared. Boots hammered stone. Varric rose and silenced them with a single bellow. Then he dismissed everything. He called the display in Sector 4 an illusion, primitive light sorcery meant to break weak minds. No species could dominate the spur without Kalin knowledge. Humanity, he declared, was deceitful and hiding behind false sensor readings. Xyler tried to protest. They brought 75 dreadnoughts. They dismantled the Voidpiercer for scrap. Varric cut him off by drawing his ceremonial blade, its edge glowing with heat. He announced that he would personally lead the armada into Sector 4. They would burn the human industrial ships, trace the home world beyond them, and remind the galaxy who ruled the stars. The council answered with a bloodthirsty roar. Then the great stone doors blew open. A communications officer stumbled inside, dropped to his knees beside Xyler, and gasped the words that drained the chamber of sound. High Counselor, the orbital defense grid has been compromised. The chamber froze. High Counselor Varric still stood with his glowing ceremonial blade raised, but the roar had been ripped out of the room. The communications officer knelt beside Commander Xyler, shaking so hard his armor plates clicked together. He forced the report out in fragments. The orbital defense grid had not been destroyed. It had been turned off. But every interceptor battery, plasma silo, and hardwired security loop surrounding Kalin Prime had been cleanly seized. Varric demanded alarms, launches, retaliation, anything that sounded like the universe still obeyed Kalin Law. The officer could only repeat the impossible. The signal was not coming from deep space. It was coming from a vessel already hanging above the Citadel. Varric shoved him aside and activated the central projector. The tactical map vanished. In its place appeared a live orbital feed. The vessel above Kalin Prime was not a dreadnought or siege carrier. It was a sleek white yacht emblazoned with the blue and gold insignia of the United Nations. It had slipped through the defense net without triggering a response, gliding above the poisoned atmosphere like a ghost entering a locked home. The feed shifted inward to an immaculate interior. Behind a polished mahogany desk sat a human in a charcoal suit, calmly drinking from a porcelain cup as if he were beginning a meeting rather than dismantling an empire. "Good morning, Kalin Prime," he said with a practiced smile. "My name is Charles Kensington, Senior Diplomatic Envoy for the United Nations Space Command, representing the interests of the Terran corporate bloc." The council stared at him in silence. Kensington apologized for the unannounced visit in the tone of a man regretting a delayed appointment. Their communication relays, he explained, had been lacking in bandwidth, so humanity had taken the liberty of installing a quantum-entangled router on the moon. Much better signal now. Varric's jaw slackened. Had the humans disabled the defense grid? Kensington waved the concern away. Only a temporary administrative override. They had embedded a standard Trojan payload inside the treaty files Commander Xyler had downloaded. Quite elementary, really. They had simply wanted to prevent any unfortunate plasma discharges while contractors were still working. Xyler ignored the murderous glares around him and demanded to know what contractors could possibly be working on. Kensington touched a control on his desk, and the hologram split into a system-wide view. The room forgot how to breathe. At the exact 50 light-year boundary specified in the treaty, a colossal ring of infrastructure surrounded the Kalin system. It was unfinished and still impossibly vast. Thousands of drones, solar sails, industrial stations, and automated construction platforms were snapping section after section into place with machine precision. Human analysts, Kensington explained, had reviewed the Kalin profile and concluded that their species was aggressive, stubborn, and statistically likely to violate the ceasefire. Admiral Hackett had wanted to station a fleet nearby, but taxpayers disliked permanent fuel costs. So humanity had selected a cheaper solution. It was called the Rathan-Lockheed Subspace Interdiction Net. Kensington described it as a localized metric tensor field, then translated the concept into something crueler. It was a one-way gravity wall. No Kalin ship using primitive dark matter drives would ever punch through it. Any vessel attempting to cross the 50-light-year line would have its engines stripped and its wreck flagged for corporate salvage. The Kalin were free to rule Kalin Prime however they pleased. Their blood oaths, their councils, their politics, their pride, all of it could continue inside the boundary. "You put us in a cage," Varric whispered. Kensington smiled without warmth. "We prefer the term designated ecological sanctuary." That line broke something deeper than fear. Humanity had not come to erase the Kalin. Humanity had zoned them, regulated them, fenced them in the way a more advanced species might contain dangerous wildlife beside a shipping lane. Varric's sword slipped from his hand and clattered on the obsidian floor. Kensington adjusted his cuffs and finished the meeting as if he were closing a file. If Kalin Prime required emergency medical relief, they could ping the automated buoy network. Otherwise, humanity considered the matter resolved. He wished them an enjoyable quarantine and terminated the transmission. The hologram died, plunging the chamber back into geothermal gloom. No one spoke. Commander Zyler looked at the silent High Council and finally understood the full shape of what had happened. The Kalin Empire had not been conquered in glorious war. It had been zoned, regulated, and fenced in. Earth control had answered, and they had brought the full weight of human bureaucracy with them. The Kalin had finally met the apex predators of the universe, and to their everlasting horror, they were just accountants with very, very big guns. 5 standard Earth years passed, and the Kalin Empire did not burn. That was, in its own way, the cruelest part. No glorious last stand ever came. No invasion fleets descended through the ash-heavy skies of Kalin Prime. No thunder of human boots marched across their capital. The Empire simply sat behind its invisible wall and stewed in the humiliation of survival. High Counselor Varric had been quietly replaced by leaders pragmatic enough to understand that throwing rocks at a titanium wall only produced broken rocks. Commander Zyler, the only Kalin alive who had ever negotiated directly with humanity, found himself elevated into the role of chief diplomatic liaison, which in practice meant spending his days staring at a silent UN communication buoy in orbit and waiting for the species that had caged them to remember they existed. Then, on a Tuesday in the 5th year of their isolation, the sky turned violet. Klaxons screamed across the obsidian citadel. Geothermal vents surged and sputtered under a violent storm of electromagnetic interference. Zyler sprinted into the new command center and demanded a report before his eyes had even adjusted to the red emergency lighting. A junior sensor operator, scales rattling with fear, pointed toward the main display. Massive energy spikes had appeared beyond the interdiction net in Sector 4 Beta, the neighboring star system only 6 light-years away. The star itself was destabilizing. On the screen, the yellow dwarf no longer looked like a star. It looked wounded. Its perfect sphere had been stretched into grotesque distortion by vast dark geometries eclipsing its light. Jagged shadows cut across the cosmos. One council member gasped that if the star went nova, the radiation would sterilize Kalin Prime within years. Zyler stared at the shapes blotting out the sun and felt a deeper, colder dread than he had in the council chamber. He recognized that ugly scale. Those were human ships. Industrial ships. But these were not the salvage hulks that had swarmed the Voidpiercer. These things were so large they looked like moons with engines. Then the dormant UN buoy chimed politely. The screen split, and a human face appeared. Not a soldier. Not a diplomat. This one wore a faded gray polo, a bright yellow hard hat, and thick work goggles pushed up onto his forehead. He looked exhausted. He drank from a dented thermal mug. When he spoke, his tone carried the weary indifference of a man calling in about a scheduling issue. Kalin Prime Control, this is David Miller, Site Director for Beal Halliburton Stellar Engineering. Can I get a comms check? You guys receiving this? Zyler stepped to the microphone. He identified himself. Then he asked the only question that mattered. What are you doing to the neighboring star? Are you destroying it to punish us? David Miller blinked, then let out a tired little laugh. Punish you? Buddy, nobody at corporate has thought about you guys in 5 years. We're not destroying it. We're harvesting it. The translation matrix almost stumbled on the phrase. Harvesting a star. David explained it with the same tone a dock foreman might use to describe lifting cargo containers. The United Nations had approved a new Dyson Swarm project to power fresh slipspace bypass lanes reaching toward the Andromeda Fringe. Sector 4 Beta had been flagged as a prime candidate for stellar mass extraction. They were cracking the star's mantle and siphoning plasma directly into zero-point containment cells. Big job. Lots of debris. Which was why he was calling. He pulled up a holographic clipboard and tapped at it while the Kalin Command Center stood in complete silence. The next step, he explained, would trigger a localized gamma-ray burst that would fry anything within 20 light-years. Under normal circumstances that would have made the region uninhabitable. But OSHA had required a Class 4 radiation blast shield around any inhabited world in the splash zone before work could begin. Zyler stared at him, mandibles barely moving. A blast shield, he managed. David jerked a thumb over his shoulder. The localized metric tensor field. The interdiction net around your system. Yeah, Hackett filed it as a military quarantine back in Geneva for political optics, but honestly, mostly an OSHA compliance measure. We couldn't start strip mining your neighboring star until we were sure your atmosphere wouldn't get boiled off by the backwash. Then he smiled the tired smile of a man delivering useful workplace clarification. You guys are literally just in a hard hat zone. Something in Zyler's legs almost gave way. For 5 years the Kalin had endured the shame of believing they had been caged because they were dangerous. That belief had been their last comfort. If humanity had feared them even a little, then perhaps their surrender still meant something. But this was worse. They were not a species quarantined out of strategic necessity. They were indigenous wildlife inside a safety perimeter while the real work happened next door. The interdiction net was not a prison. It was a cosmic warning cone set around an anthill before the bulldozers arrived. Zyler forced himself to ask whether the shield would hold. Oh, absolutely, David said cheerfully. Rathan builds good stuff. You'll get some wild light shows in your sky for the next 8 to 10 months while we drain the star, but your planetary temperature won't move more than a degree. Just don't try to fly anything into the net while gamma wash is rolling over it. It'll vaporize you. Zyler said they would remain grounded. Then David leaned closer to the screen as if remembering one last thing. Once the star was fully harvested, there would be a massive debris field of dead planetary rock. His logistics AI indicated the Kalin species had solid experience in dense metals extraction. Beal Halliburton was looking to subcontract cleanup. UN standard rates. Full dental. 10% of the refined alloys retained by the workers. Think your people would be interested in some honest work? Zyler turned and looked at the High Council. The proud warlords of the Orion Spur stood there with the shell-shocked expressions of creatures who had just watched a god put on a hard hat. Then he turned back to the screen. Director Miller, Zyler said, send us the contract. We are ready to review the terms. 10 years later, the Ulysses dropped out of slipspace near the edge of Sector 4, and the ship looked unchanged. It was still a flying brick with radiator fins glowing dull red in the dark. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rico Stanton was losing a war with the coffee dispenser. I do not understand, Rico muttered, hitting the machine. We upgraded the engines. We upgraded the routing AI. But Mark still refuses to replace this piece of garbage. Arthur Pendleton chuckled from the pilot's seat. It builds character, Cap. Besides, we're on approach to the Kalin Prime refueling depot. You can get something decent at the station. Sarah Jenkins announced their docking vector. Then the viewport shield slid back, and the Kalin system opened before them. Kalin Prime still turned below in sulfur and ash, but orbit was no longer empty. A sprawling station painted in industrial yellow ringed the world. Cargo haulers, destroyers, and blocky Kalin transports moved together in a regulated stream. And where Sector 4 Beta had once burned as a star, there was only a contained sphere of artificial light. A fully operational Dyson swarm hummed there, powering a quarter of the Orion spur. Then the comm crackled. The voice was deep, guttural, and unmistakably alien. Yet it carried the polished, soul-crushing cadence of a bureaucrat. Mark Freighter Ulysses, this is Kalin Orbital Control. We have received your telemetry. You are drifting 3 meters per second above the posted speed limit for this docking lane. Adjust your thrusters immediately, or you will be subject to a Level 2 civil infraction. Rico smiled and leaned over Sarah's shoulder. Sorry about that, Control. Adjusting vector now. Good to hear your voice again, Zyler. There was a pause. Then Zyler answered, and under the bureaucratic weight there was the faintest trace of warmth. Captain Stanton, it is good to see your vessel still flying. Though I must remind you that personal familiarity does not exempt you from customs inspection. Sarah opened the cargo scan. Rico eased the ship into lane. Beyond the glass, Kalin Prime turned beneath traffic beacons, and Commander Zyler, once terror of the Orion spur, went back to directing orbital shipping.